the dust of the high plain settled on Caleb Blackwood's shoulders like a shroud. It clung to the worn leather of his saddle, the cracked handle of his Colt, and the hollow spaces in his heart where a life used to be. He rode not toward a home, but a structure of wooden memory that had become a monument to his grief. Behind him, on a tired buckboard wagon, sat the consequence of his folly, the punchline to a cruel joke told over whiskey and cards. He had not gone to the saloon in dusty redemption to gamble, but to forget. Instead, he had won. He had won a woman. The laughter of the other men, sharp and brittle as sun-baked bone, still echoed in his ears. Finch, a man whose soul was as barren as the land he coveted, had thrown her into the pot with a sneer. My indentured cook, he'd called her, though the word was a thin veil for something uglier. Too much woman for one man, the joke had landed, and the pot was his. Now, the joke rode behind him, a silent, sizable woman named Agnes. He expected weeping, or pleading, or perhaps a fury that matched the storm inside his own chest. He expected anything but the profound stillness that radiated from her as he reined in his horse before the skeletal frame of his ranch house. She did not wait for him to help her down. She moved with a slow, deliberate weight, her feet landing on the parched earth with a soft finality. In the fading light, her shadow stretched long and deep, a stark figure against the unforgiving landscape. He strode toward her, the silence between them a living thing. His voice, when it came, was rust. The house is there. A room in the back. You work, you eat. It was a transaction, nothing more. Her eyes, the color of a twilight sky, met his. There was no fear in them, only a deep, unsettling knowing. She looked at his house, at the untended grave of his wife Martha on the nearby hill, and then back at him. Her voice was low, a current beneath a frozen river. I am not the curse you think I am, she said, and the words seemed to pull the last of the day's warmth from the air. The curse is the man who sent me here. He will come for what is yours, Mr. Blackwood. Not for me. A tremor, cold and sharp, ran through Caleb. It was not a fear of her, this woman won in a game of chance, but a terrifying premonition, a dread that her words were not a guess, but a prophecy forged in the same fire that had hardened her gaze. He had brought home a stranger, but he felt with chilling certainty that she had brought with her a reckoning. He showed her the room without another word. It was little more than a closet, furnished with a narrow cot and a single crate for a table. A film of dust covered everything, a fine grey powder that tasted of abandonment. He left her there, closing the door on her silence, and retreated to the cold comfort of a whiskey bottle. He drank until Martha's ghost faded from the corners of the room, and then he slept a sleep as deep and empty as a winter grave. He awoke not to the familiar ache of solitude, but to a scent that unmoored him from his grief. Coffee. Rich and dark, a smell he hadn't known in his own home for 2 long years. He followed it to the kitchen, a space that had been Martha's heart, and which he had allowed to grow cold and still. There, Agnes moved before the cast-iron stove. Her sighs, which had been the subject of such cruel amusement in the saloon, seemed to vanish in the quiet competence of her movements. She was not clumsy or slow, but measured and efficient, her hands, broad and capable, kneading dough on a floured board with a practiced rhythm. She had already swept the floor, wiped the grime from the window panes, and coaxed a steady, warm flame from the hearth. She did not look at him as he stood framed in the doorway, a spectre in his own house. She simply poured a cup of coffee from the pot and set it on the table, a silent offering. He drank it. It was strong and hot, and it burned away some of the frost that had settled deep in his bones. He watched her slide a loaf of bread into the oven, her movements economical and graceful. She was transforming the space, breathing life back into the dead heart of his home, and she was doing it without permission, without a single word. It was an invasion, a gentle and terrifying conquest of his sorrow. He felt a wall within him, meticulously built from loss and anger, begin to show the faintest of cracks, and the feeling was so foreign, so unwelcome, that he turned and fled the warmth of the kitchen, seeking the familiar cold of the open range. He worked himself to exhaustion, mending fences that didn't need mending, his hands raw, his mind a maelstrom. But he could not outrun the scent of baking bread. His daughter was a whisper. Lily, a child of 6, had faded into the background of his life after her mother's passing. Her laughter had been buried with Martha, her voice shrinking until it was lost entirely in the vast, echoing silence of the house. She moved like a phantom, her small, pale face a constant, heart-breaking reminder of all he had lost. She watched Agnes from the shadows, a tiny, wary creature observing an unknown beast. Her eyes, wide and solemn, followed the woman's every move. Agnes, for her part, seemed not to notice, or perhaps, she understood the language of wounded things. She did not try to speak to the girl, did not offer a false smile or a cooing word. She simply existed, a large, calming presence in the chaotic silence. She would leave a small, warm biscuit on the table where she knew Lily would find it. She mended a tear in the child's worn dress, the stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, and left it folded on her bed. These were offerings left at the edge of a clearing, invitations that asked for nothing in return. One afternoon, as the low sun cast long shadows across the kitchen floor, Agnes was humming a low, tuneless sound like the drone of a bee in summer clover. She was peeling apples, the red skins falling in a continuous spiral from her knife. Lily crept from the shadows of the hallway and stood, just for a moment, in the doorway. Agnes did not turn. She simply sliced a piece of apple, crisp and white, and placed it on the edge of the wooden table. Then she went back to her work. For a long time, the slice of apple sat untouched. Caleb watched from the window, his breath held tight in his chest. Then, a small hand, thin as a bird's claw, darted out and snatched the offering. The child retreated back into the shadows to eat it, but she had crossed a threshold. A bridge, fragile and shimmering, had been built in the quiet space between a broken child and a discarded woman. For the first time in 2 years, Caleb felt a pang of something that was not grief, but a tentative, terrifying flicker of hope. He turned away from the window, his own heart a battlefield of warring emotions. The days bled into weeks, each one marked by the quiet rhythm Agnes had imposed upon the household. The sterile order of grief was replaced by the living order of care. The windows no longer looked like clouded eyes, they were clean, letting in the harsh, beautiful light of the plains. The scent of dust and decay was replaced by the smells of stew and polish and drying herbs. Caleb's flannel shirts, once frayed and buttonless, were now mended, the patches sewn with a neat, sturdy hand. He found a thick, woolen blanket, one of Martha's, washed and aired and folded at the foot of his bed. The gesture was so intimate, so presumptuous, that it angered him. He threw it to the floor. But in the cold heart of the night, when the wind scraped against the house like dry whispers, he found himself reaching for it, pulling its warmth around his shoulders, and hating himself for the comfort it gave. Agnes had claimed the small, fallow patch of earth behind the house that Martha had called a garden. With a spade and a relentless patience, she broke the hard, unforgiving soil. She worked from sunup to sundown, her large frame bent over the earth, her hands coaxing green shoots from the dirt. She spoke to the seedlings in a low murmur, a language of encouragement that Caleb could not comprehend. He watched her from a distance, this woman who nurtured life in a place defined by death. Her presence was a constant, low hum against the screaming silence of his loss. He never spoke to her of anything beyond the necessities of the ranch, and she never offered more than a quiet nod in return. Yet, a conversation was happening between them, in the shared space of the house, in the food she prepared, in the order she created from his chaos. He was a man who communicated through action, and he understood what she was doing. She was healing his home. The terrifying part was the slow, creeping realization that she might be healing him, too. He found himself noticing the small things, the way her brow furrowed in concentration when she sewed, the surprising gentleness in her hands as she weeded the garden, the deep, steady cadence of her breathing as she slept in the room down the hall. His world, once a monochrome of sorrow, was slowly, unwillingly, being filled with color. Lily's world was the first to regain its vibrancy. The whisper she had directed at the floorboards and the dust motes in sunbeams now found a new target. She began to speak to Agnes, her voice a fragile thread of sound. She would ask about the names of the plants in the garden, or what made the bread rise, or why the moon changed its shape. Agnes would answer in her calm, even tone, her voice a steady anchor for the child's tentative explorations of language. The house, once a tomb, now held the small, bright sounds of a child's questions and a woman's patient replies. Caleb remained the storm cloud on the horizon of their small, sunlit world. He was a presence of brooding silence, a figure of authority and sorrow that Lily orbited with caution. One evening, the three of them were in the main room. A fire crackled in the hearth, a bulwark against the coming chill of the plains night. Agnes was knitting, her needles clicking with a soft, metallic rhythm. Caleb was cleaning his rifle, the scent of oil and steel sharp in the air. Lily sat on the floor with a piece of charcoal and a sheet of brown paper, utterly absorbed. After a long period of silence, she stood up and walked to Agnes, holding out the paper. On it were three figures. One was a large, round, smiling sun, radiating bright, cheerful lines. Next to it was a small, simple flower with its face turned toward the sun. On the other side of the page, separate from the others, was a dark, jagged shape, a thunderhead spitting scribbled lines of rain. Lily pointed to the sun. "That's you," she said to Agnes, her voice clear and certain. She pointed to the flower. "That's me then," her small finger moved to the dark shape. She looked not at Agnes, but across the room at her father. In the quiet, firelit room, her question fell with the weight of a stone. "Why is Papa a storm cloud?" Agnes stopped knitting. Caleb's hands froze on his rifle. The child's simple, devastatingly accurate perception of him, voiced with such innocence, stripped him bare. It was not an accusation, but a fact. He was the storm. He was the darkness in his own home, in his own daughter's life. He couldn't breathe. Without a word, he stood, placed the rifle back on its rack, and walked out into the cold, dark night, the innocent question chasing him into the vast, unforgiving emptiness. The winter came on fast and mean, a bitter wind sweeping down from the mountains, carrying the promise of snow. With it came the fever. It moved through the sparse homesteads of the valley like a phantom thief, stealing the breath from the young and the old. Caleb felt a familiar dread, a cold serpent coiling in his gut. It was a fever just like this one that had taken Martha, her life burning out in a matter of days, leaving him with nothing but ash and a silent child. When Lily coughed, a dry, rattling sound that echoed too closely the cough he could never forget, the serpent in his stomach tightened its grip. By nightfall, she was burning. Her skin was hot to the touch, her breathing shallow and fast. Panic, cold and absolute, seized Caleb. He was frozen in time, reliving the helpless horror of watching his wife slip away. The doctor was in Redemption, a full day's ride, and the sky was already a bruised, heavy grey, spitting the first hard pellets of snow. He was paralyzed, a storm cloud incapable of anything but raining down his own fear. It was Agnes who moved. She touched Lily's forehead with a hand that was surprisingly cool and steady. "Get more wood for the fire," she said, her voice cutting through his panic. "And bring me snow." A clean bucket of it. Her command was so direct, so certain, that he obeyed without thought. While he was gone, she stripped the child of her sweat-soaked nightgown and began to bathe her forehead and limbs with cool water. She sent him to the pantry for the herbs she had harvested and dried, for willow bark and yarrow. She brewed a bitter tea, forcing it gently between Lily's cracked lips. The blizzard hit with the force of a physical blow, screaming around the corners of the small house, piling drifts against the doors and windows. They were trapped, an island in a sea of white. For 2 days and 2 nights, Agnes did not leave the child's side. She was a mountain of resolve, her large body a shield against the fever. She held Lily, she bathed her, she spoke to her in a low, soothing murmur, her presence a constant, unwavering vigil. Caleb could only watch, a useless, terrified ghost, as this woman he had won as a joke fought for his daughter's life with a strength he had never known. In the long, suffocating hours of the blizzard, with the wind howling its mournful song and the life of his child hanging by a thread, the walls between Caleb and Agnes finally crumbled into dust. They sat on either side of Lily's small bed, the flickering lamplight carving their faces from the darkness. The silence was no longer a weapon or a shield, it was a shared space of fear and exhaustion. "She looks like her," Caleb said, his voice a raw whisper. He didn't have to say the name. Martha's presence was a constant ghost in the room. The fever, it was the same. He spoke of his wife then, of the way she had laughed, of the plans they had made, of the utter helplessness he had felt as he watched her die. The words poured out of him, a torrent of grief held back for 2 years. Agnes listened, her gaze never leaving his, her expression one of profound empathy. When he was finished, his confession leaving him hollowed and raw, she spoke. Her own story came not in a rush, but in quiet, measured sentences. She spoke of a life lived on the margins, of being judged and discarded for her size, of the constant, quiet pain of being seen as less than human. She spoke of Finch. He didn't buy my indenture, she said, her voice dropping lower. He won me from my father, who was too drunk and too deep in debt to care. He saw me as property, a thing to be used and mocked. She looked at the sleeping child between them. He doesn't just covet land, Mr. Blackwood. He covets what other men have. He enjoys breaking things. My warning to you, it was not a guess. It was a promise. He let you win me because he knew it would bring him here, to your door. He wants to see you broken. The revelation settled in the room, heavy and cold as the snow outside. They were not just a man, a woman, and a child trapped by a storm. They were two broken people, bound by their shared wounds and a common enemy. In that small, lamp-lit room, surrounded by the raging blizzard, a fragile alliance was forged, a bond created not of love, but of mutual desperation and a dawning, reluctant respect. They were no longer strangers. They were survivors. The blizzard broke on the third morning. The wind died, leaving behind a world of stunning, silent white. In the stillness, Lily's fever broke as well. The heat receded from her skin, her breathing deepened, and she fell into a true, healing sleep. The relief that washed over Caleb was so immense it almost brought him to his knees. He looked at Agnes, who was slumped in her chair, her face etched with exhaustion but her eyes clear. He could not find the words to thank her. The debt he owed was too vast, too profound for simple language. So he just nodded, a gesture that carried the weight of everything he could not say. A fragile peace settled over the ranch in the days that followed. The world outside was hushed and clean, and for the first time, the world inside felt the same. Lily recovered quickly, her return to health bringing a light and laughter to the house that Caleb thought had been extinguished forever. She followed Agnes everywhere, a small, devoted shadow. But the peace was a borrowed thing, a brief calm before the inevitable storm. Just as Agnes had prophesied, Finch arrived. He came a week after the thaw, with 2 hired men at his back, their horses trampling the melting snow. He did not look like a man coming to claim a debt, he looked like a vulture circling a kill. He dismounted, a cruel smile twisting his lips as he took in the sight of the ranch. He saw the clean windows, the wisp of smoke from the chimney, the evidence of a home brought back to life. His eyes landed on Agnes, who stood on the porch, with Lily half hidden behind her skirts. "Well, Blackwood," Finch sneered, his gaze raking over Agnes with contempt. "I see you kept the prize sow, fattening her up for winter." The words were meant to wound, to humiliate. 2 years ago, Caleb would have responded with the cold, hard language of his fists or his gun. He would have met the ugliness with a greater violence. But he was not the same man. The storm inside him had finally passed. He looked past Finch's sneering face. He looked at Agnes, at her stoic and dignified posture, her hands resting protectively on Lily's shoulders. He saw not the punchline to a joke, but the woman who had faced down death to save his child. He saw the quiet strength that had rebuilt his home and his heart from the rubble of his grief. He saw the sun that had made his little flower bloom again. He saw his family. He stepped forward, moving to stand slightly in front of Agnes and Lily, a simple, declarative act of protection. He did not reach for the gun at his hip. His strength was no longer in the cold steel he carried, but in the warmth that had been rekindled within him. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, devoid of anger, but filled with an unshakable, absolute resolve that was more intimidating than any threat. "This is my home," he said, his eyes locked on Finch's. He then gestured slightly with his head toward Agnes and the child behind him. "This is my family." The words were simple, but they were a vow, a public claim that redrew the lines of his world. "You will leave this land now." Finch was taken aback. He had expected rage, a fight, a satisfying explosion of the broken man he had come to ruin. He did not know how to combat this calm, solid certainty. "I have the deed, Blackwood," Finch blustered, pulling a piece of paper from his coat. "Your debt is paid with this land. The paper is a lie, and you are a coward," Caleb stated, the words flat and true. "You prey on the weak and the grieving." "But my grieving is done." He took another step forward. His men shifted, their hands moving toward their guns. Caleb did not flinch. "Leave, or you will be carried from this place." There was no hatred in his voice, only the cold promise of a man who had found something worth defending, something worth dying for. Finch, a bully who only understood the language of fear and dominance, saw something in Caleb's eyes he had never seen before, a man who was not afraid. He hesitated, his bluster failing him. With a final, venomous curse, he wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over," he spat, before riding away, his men trailing behind him like defeated dogs. Caleb stood his ground until they were nothing but small specks on the horizon. The victory was quiet, but absolute. That evening, the world felt new. The setting sun painted the snow-covered plains in hues of rose and gold. The air in the house was warm, thick with the smell of roasting chicken and the lingering scent of wood smoke. They ate their meal in a comfortable silence, a new language they had learned together. The silence was no longer about what was broken, but about what was being built. Lily, tired from the day, fell asleep with her head in Agnes's lap, her small chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. Agnes stroked the child's hair, her large hand infinitely gentle. Caleb watched them, his heart full of a feeling so potent it was almost painful. The house was no longer a tomb, it was a sanctuary. The fire in the hearth burned bright, and for the first time, it was matched by a fire in his own soul. After Agnes had carried Lily to her bed, she returned to the main room. She stood by the fire, her back to him, her shoulders slumped with the release of the day's tension. Caleb rose from his chair and walked to her. He didn't speak. Words were insufficient for the gratitude, the respect, the dawning love he felt for this woman. He reached out and took her hand. Her skin was rough from work, but her hand was warm, and it fit in his as if it were made to be there. She turned to face him, her twilight eyes searching his. He saw her past in them, the pain and the loneliness, but he also saw an incredible, resilient strength. He lifted her hand and gently kissed her knuckles. It was a gesture of fealty, of reverence. It was a promise. He was still a man of few words, but in that single touch, he told her everything. He told her she was not a prize won in a game, but a treasure he would spend the rest of his life earning. He told her she was beautiful. He told her she was home. A single tear traced a path down Agnes's cheek, but it was not a tear of sorrow. It was the final melting of a long and bitter winter, the first drop of a coming spring. Outside, the stars emerged in the vast, dark sky, cold and distant, but inside the small house on the plains, 3 broken souls had finally, against all odds, become a constellation. They had found their warmth in the darkness.